Hello and welcome, YouTube. My name is Jacob Toman, and I serve as the lead pastor at Ada Christian Reformed Church in Ada, Michigan. And I'm very excited today for our discussion with Mr. Bruce Gore, who's been kind enough to give us some of his time today to answer some questions about his own eschatological background and journey. A couple of news and notes here before getting into our interview with Mr. Bruce Gore is, of course, you can like, subscribe, and ding the bell down below to be notified about future video discussions very similar to this one. Also, thanks so much to everybody who has joined the membership team and is supporting Eschatology Matters through the YouTube membership function. We're very, very thankful for your support. All of that support goes towards supporting and producing all sorts of wonderful discussions just like this one, as well as conferences like our recently held conference in Topeka, Indiana, featuring discussions and lectures and breakout sessions discussing the kingdom of God. If you're looking for more discussions relating to eschatology, you can always check out our website, Eschatology Matters, or you can stick around here, poke around on the YouTube channel, and of course, you'll come across many familiar faces or maybe some new faces discussing themes and topics all relating to why eschatology matters from Genesis through Revelation, a whole Bible view of eschatology. Without any further ado, let's jump over to our discussion today with Mr. Bruce Gore. Well, I am here today with Bruce Gore, and so Bruce, thank you so much for being willing to take some time today and discuss eschatology with us together. I've heard you share this story in numerous different circumstances, but for those who haven't gotten to hear about who Bruce Gore is, and particularly who the Lord Jesus Christ is for Bruce Gore, walk us through a little bit of your background. What was it like for you growing up? Talk to us a little bit about Whitworth College and about how the Lord is using you even now.
Well, thanks for the question. I feel like I've got the most ordinary life one could imagine. So this is a real short story of a real boring life, but grew up in a rural community, a pretty rigid Baptist. That was my background. I've never resented that. I'm not a Baptist anymore, but I like the emphasis on the Bible. My Sunday school teachers taught those Old Testament Bible stories, and when you learn these things as a kid, they tend to stay with you for a long time. So I've always appreciated that. Went to Whitworth University. It was Whitworth College at the time in 1967, which was somewhat of a disturbing thing to do, at least with respect to some of the people in my little rural conservative Baptist church who thought, if I went to Whitworth, I would certainly become liberal and lose my faith, And I don't know, they probably thought I did. I'm not sure. But anyway, I wound up there, and really it was a wonderful time of kind of expanding my perspective on religious traditions and so on. I still graduated a Baptist and dispensational in my outlook, but I did at least discover one deep truth while I was at Whitworth, among many, but one in particular. My favorite prof there was a retired Presbyterian pastor turned, philosophy professor at Whitworth. And for the first time in my life, I realized a person could be both a Presbyterian and a Christian at the same time. I'd never been quite sure of that, but that certainly convinced me that I needed to broaden my perspective a bit. When I first got out of college, I was working in Christian broadcasting, so I thought that's probably what I would do for a career, working actually for Moody Bible Institute. They have a radio station here in Spokane, and so I was working for them and thought that would probably be my career track. But a little school opened up in Spokane called the Inland Empire School of the Bible. It doesn't exist anymore, but at the time, it was just a little kind of a fly-by-night Bible school. It was the faculty were all local pastors who would come in and teach a class or two. And I had the bravado to go down and think I should be a teacher there. And of course, the people that ran the school kind of fell out of their chairs, like, what qualifications do you have to do such a thing? But I was able to bluff my way into teaching speech because I was in radio and I had some background in that regard. And over about a year and a half, actually morphed into a full-time faculty member. I've always been very grateful to God. I think looking back on it, it's a bit of a miracle that it took place just that way. But I was willing to leave the broadcasting biz and become a full-time teacher there at less pay, actually, than I made at the radio station. But I loved teaching so much that I really wanted to seize on that opportunity. When I got the job at the beginning at that school, I was still a confirmed dispensationalist. I left the school 7 years later, a confirmed Presbyterian and one who had rejected dispensationalism. I left on friendly terms. The reason that transformation took place was every year I had to defend dispensationalism, and every year I saw more chinks in the armor, more inconsistencies, more troubling problems. And my feeling was that the people who were the great scholars of dispensationalism were being a little dishonest, because the questions that occurred to me, like if the seed of Abraham are those of faith in Christ, then how come you keep insisting the seed of Abraham are Jewish people who are going to still get the promises to Abraham and his seed in some time in the future? Where's the explanation for that inconsistency and other things like it? Paul says, they are not all Israel who are of Israel. A person descending from Israel is not necessarily legitimately true Israel, and so on. And so gradually, then I started looking at more broadly. I came across R.C. Sproul, who himself was not dispensational, but was certainly not, I don't think he was in any clear eschatological school at the time. This was back in the 70s. He did become more clear in his eschatology in later years, but at the time, he still saw the Olivet Discourse as referring to future events and kind of interpreted it that way and didn't know what to do with that verse that said, this generation will not pass away till all these things be fulfilled. But anyway, just being exposed to that Calvinistic Reformed understanding, a Presbyterian, a view of history that certainly was not nearly as pessimistic as the dispensational view I'd been schooled in. All of that got into me, and over time I just became aware that even though I was required to sign a doctrinal statement every year that said without mental reservation I embrace these dispensational ideas, I was increasingly fraught with mental reservations until finally, on really cordial terms, I left the school. In fact, they were sorry to lose me. They asked me to speak at the graduation that year, the very year I resigned, and so it was a very cordial thing. I bear no grudge whatsoever to the school or anything, or the people that were once running the school. But anyway, from there, I was kind of bouncing around, decided I better go to law school because I needed a job. And so I was able to get into law school just on a part-time basis, but slogged my way through in 4 years. And from that point, practiced law for about 20 years here in Spokane. The last few years, I went back to teaching at a classical Christian school here in Spokane called the Oaks, teaching high school students Bible, philosophy, history, Greek, that sort of thing. And now I'm just a retired guy, and my main job is I work 1 hour a week teaching a Sunday school class. And much to my astonishment, these classes that have been uploaded to YouTube have gotten much, much more attention and traction than I ever anticipated. And so it's been very gratifying and just a great blessing for me to be able to interact with people all over the world and answer questions and sometimes very good criticism are raised. I'm always grateful to get a good, solid critique of something I've said. Sometimes I get it wrong, and I'm glad to make corrections when the corrections are required. So anyway, that's kind of the short version of how I got here.
That's great. And I'm hearing in all of these answers, particularly as you're talking about your life and your experience as you've been exposed to and studied and learned different eschatological outlooks, and just as you've grown as a believer in your love for the Lord and in your study of God's Word, I just loved how you've continually brought in, hey, these were graceful departures. These were conversations that were marked by cordiality. A word that I oftentimes hear you use when you are referring to something that does not turn out well biblically is ghastly. You'll say, that's just ghastly. That comes up from time to time. But I haven't heard you once describe any of these experiences with brothers and sisters in the Lord who might be coming from a different eschatological outlook as ghastly. These are cordial expressions and cordial experiences. We may have differences of understanding, but there's still cordiality there. I recognize that this isn't necessarily forming into a question, so let me turn this into a question. As you've navigated those conversations with folks, and as you've explored and grown and studied the Word in your own eschatological convictions, how would you say you've walked through those sorts of conversations with folks who have disagreed with you? How do you maintain cordiality and maintain, even we could say, a spirit of love and unity, even in the midst of areas of disagreement? How do you walk through that with folks?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question, and I feel like I've not been nearly as good at this as I ought to be, but to me, at least, the one-word answer is humility. And, I say that not considering myself any kind of, model of humility. I've got as much ego in me as anybody else, I suppose, and sometimes I think much worse. But nevertheless, it does seem to me that we all are groping in the darkness to some degree. I believe that what I have embraced is consistent with God's Word. But I want to be humble enough to admit that I still haven't got all the right answers. That all of us, to some degree or other, are believing things that don't hit the mark. I remember R.C. Sproul saying once in a lecture I listened to from him, he figured he was probably about 80% Orthodox. He said if someone could point out the other 20%, he corrected in a heartbeat. He just didn't know what it was yet.
Yep.
And that led me to think, as a Christian believer, certainly as a teacher, as someone involved in ministry, I think it's always important that we affirm the importance of the truth we are pursuing a little bit more than the truth we are possessing. I mean, I'm very, I'm committed to Orthodox Christianity. I'm Trinitarian. I believe in the dual nature of Christ. I believe in the substitutionary atonement. I believe it's not by any merit of mine. I think those are safe and important biblical truths that we can cling to. But if I build my monument on those truths that I possess and sort of assume, okay, that's all I need to know, that's all I need to teach, that's the end of the story, then to that degree, I've compromised with heresy, because somewhere in my thinking, there's some loose ends, there's some inconsistencies, there's some questions that I'm not getting the right answers to. Hopefully, those questions become more and more subtle as one grows in understanding, but you still have to have the humility to recognize that, we've all got something to learn. So I have very close friends who are Roman Catholic, very close. In fact, I would consider one of my very, very closest friends is a devout Roman Catholic. We get together once a week. We have wonderful conversations. And he's helped me understand some things. He hasn't changed my theology, but he's certainly given me an improved understanding of how various traditions approach matters of faith. And that's helpful. I think to build all those bridges is a good, healthy kind of sort of objective for us to maintain. And so anyway, that's I guess the best answer I can give to a very good question.
No, that's great. That's great. Of course, Moses' commentary comes to mind. Moses was the most humble man, on the face of the earth.
That's right.
But nonetheless, it gives us, I love the way how you said that, the truth that we possess versus the truth that we pursue, that's an important distinction there. And so as you've pursued truth and as you've come to possess truth, I'd love to hear some more of your stories and some of your thoughts about some of those influential thinkers. You've already mentioned R.C. Sproul. And then, of course, throughout your different lecture series, which, of course, folks can find on your YouTube channel, you've got a number of wonderful playlists. Anybody who knows me on Facebook knows that I'm referencing you and citing you multiple times throughout the week whenever I'm making recommendations for folks to do Bible studies. So you are a wonderful source and resource of citation. So who are some of those thinkers, just here in a nutshell, who are some of those thinkers like R.C. Sproul who have helped you in your own eschatological journey? And I'll let you think about that just for a moment while I also plug Bruce Gore has done a great series on the entire book of Revelation. He's walked through it. We'll talk about that here in a few minutes, where he walks through from a partial preterist perspective. Am I getting that right, Bruce?
Yeah, that's correct. You bet.
Okay, great. So tell us a little bit more about some of these authors that have been impactful to you in your walk through moving from dispensational to a more covenantal approach through the scriptures into your eschatological approaches as well.
Yeah, that's a good question. I by the way, on the term partial preterist, that would be technically what I would call myself. I don't ever use that term. I don't say I'm a partial preterist. And I think the reason is I have an aversion to being a partial anything. You know, I want to be all in for Jesus. I want to believe the truth of him. And I prefer to say that I simply embrace what I call a theology of hope. Meaning that history is going somewhere, that when Jesus gave the Great Commission to go into the world, make disciples of the nations, teaching them to observe what he's commanded, that is a commission he gave his church with a full expectation that the command would be realized, because he promised to be with us in that project. And so that tells me that history is going somewhere, that it ultimately is going to realize what he told us to do, and that therefore history has a proper conclusion at some point in the future. And I think that distinguishes me from what are sometimes called full preterists, who want to put all of that eschatological event, sort of in the first century. And so I use the term guardedly, but I prefer the term theology of hope. That's no criticism of you. I'm just making that more as a kind of a clarifying remark.
No, I'm with you, and I think you make that clear as well in your wonderful playlist and on your teachings about the Puritans and their eschatological outlook of hope, right, and Edwards. But anyway, sorry, back to you. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. I think probably the first author that really affected me, and I wouldn't say he changed my views, but he certainly helped me to sort of solidify or crystallize what I was intuitively thinking, was a fellow named David Chilton. I'm certain that you're familiar with him. He's now with the Lord. But I remember reading a book years ago that was entitled Paradise Restored, is the title of the book. And I don't know how I came across it, but this was back probably in the late 80s, early 90s, I want to say, something like that. I was at the time still somewhat uneasy about what to do with Revelation. I knew that I didn't buy off on the kind of the dispensational view that this is all a compacted description of what's going to happen in the last days, especially those last 7 years, Jacob's trouble, the 70th year of Daniel, all of that, that view. Somehow that didn't strike me as realistic, because it means that not only the original recipients of that letter, but thousands of years of Christian history basically reduce the book to irrelevance. If it's only describing what's happening in the future, even if it's the near future for us, well, what did Martin Luther think of that? What about John Calvin? What about Augustine? What about these great thinkers? Was the book simply not, of any use to them? And I know for a while I was tempted to toy around with what's called the historicist approach, which saw Revelation as really just describing great movements in history, great events. I did a little reading in that area. The one thing that really impressed me about it was that nobody agreed on anything. When you take the historicist approach, I find people who are very dogmatic. This has got to be the rise of Islam. This has got to be the Reformation. This has got to be this. This has got to be that. And yet you read the next historicist, they take a totally different view. And there's no frame of reference. We have no objective guide by which to say, in the historicist frame of, a view of things, this is certainly the meaning of that particular image, that particular monster or beast or whatever. You just don't have any way to nail down with certainty, with confidence, what a particular image is supposed to symbolize in Christian history. So I knew all of that left me uneasy, and I don't think, honestly, Jacob, that I had even ever really thought seriously about a preterist approach to Revelation, because when I got a master's degree in history back in the late 70s, I studied the Puritans pretty closely, and they were, of course, postmillennial. But my impression of postmillennialism had always been that it led to liberalism, and that the people that really took that view tended to be liberal scholars who wanted to say, well, Revelation was just John describing stuff that happened way back when. And basically he got it wrong because they all assumed he wrote the book in about 95 under Domitian, and that everything that he predicted was going to happen in the near term didn't. By anybody's measures, it didn't happen. Therefore, John got it wrong, but hey, he's still a good guy, and we can read the book, and we can get some benefit from it, even though he was completely wrong in what he said in Revelation. So, those people took the view, and I guess I'd always had the impression, if you take that kind of preterist approach, you're a liberal, and you think that John just didn't get the right answer. Then, somewhere around 1990, I came across a set of cassettes. Somebody loaned them to me. I can't remember exactly what happened, but it was by a Christian pastor, a Presbyterian pastor in Seattle at University Presbyterian Church. His name was Earl Palmer. And Earl Palmer had done a series on Revelation. And in this series, he had taken the view, which I never really had an opportunity to seriously consider it till those cassettes. It was like 12 cassettes, that tells how old I am. These are cassettes.
Front side, and back, and you had to push the button to rewind it. And right. Be kind, that's rewind, right. And did you have to eject it from the cassette player and then turn it over? And it was really fancy when you got the automatic flipper. Yep.
Yeah. So anyway, for the very old people in your audience, they'll know what that is. Anyway, I listened to these cassettes. And he was arguing, well, the problem with this Domitian date is that it ignores a very credible argument that John was writing Revelation 30 years earlier, that it wasn't in 95, but it was closer to maybe 65, and that the great conflict that's being described there was triggered by Nero and his persecution of the church, of the church. And I have to say, I'm embarrassed to admit it, I'd never really put that together. I was familiar. I taught church history. I knew about Nero and all of that. I just never really thought about that in the way that he, set it forth. And so that was really the first time that I kind of rethought that whole view and thought, well, maybe that's where Revelation belongs, but everybody thinks, no, it's got to be 95. Irenaeus said it's 95. Therefore, it's got to be 95. Blah, 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 end of conversation. Earl Palmer answered that pretty effectively and gave me some new thoughts. So from there, I came across the book by Chilton. I think someone loaned it to me, David Chilton's Paradise Restored. And it's not so much a commentary on Revelation, although he does devote some time to Revelation. It's more a description of a view of what God is doing in history. You call it commonly postmillennialism, but he preferred to use the same term I did, the theology of hope. And that really did help me. All of a sudden pieces began to fall into place. Chilton also wrote later an entire commentary, I know you're aware of this, called Days of Vengeance, which is a quite thorough verse-by-verse exegesis of Revelation, and really a powerful piece of work. I think anyone that would sit down and read it with an open mind would at least admit that there's a very significant and credible case to be made, not only for the early date for Revelation, but also that it gives us remarkable insight into what Christian people were feeling and going through and thinking at the time. And certainly it all sort of gelled, I'd say, at that point. In 1993, my wife and I were in the Greek Isles. We were on a kind of vacation, cruise through the Greek Isles, and we were coming to Patmos. And I was still pretty fresh. I hadn't really thought all this through, but I was looking at Chilton. I was kind of thinking all of these things. And I thought to myself, I've always resented the book of Revelation because it's so odd. I can't make heads or tails of it. And I don't have maybe all of the historical background to recognize some of those images. So I thought to myself, I'm going to teach Revelation 1 year from now in the fall. And I made a little pact with myself that to prepare for it, I would memorize the entire book. And that's what I did. So over that year, very slowly, I didn't try to do this rapidly. I just kind of added one verse a day to this gradual growth of memorizing the book. By the time I reached the end of that, a lot of puzzle pieces that seemed somewhat, disjointed and strange and unexpected. If nothing else, I was impressed with how tightly organized, how precise is the book of Revelation. It's not just a bunch of disjointed images. It is written with a high degree of precision. And the correlation to the events that were taking place in that earlier time frame, really, I think the internal evidence becomes almost irrefutable that the book has to be dated earlier. I think the reasons people go for the late date are, first of all, this statement by Irenaeus, which, of course, is an issue, but I think there's a good answer for that. And just it's been the common view. But sometimes the common view isn't the right view, so that was kind of my own. So anyway, to answer your question, I think David Chilton is important. Ken Gentry is important. Gary DeMar, others that have kind of been in that school of thought who have made very good cases for that. I'm acquainted with Gary DeMar. We've spoken together on occasion and had an opportunity to talk with him personally about this, and that's certainly been encouraging. So those are some of the names, of course, that have had an influence in my life.
That's great. No, that's a great answer. And that's incredible. Just an encouragement to everybody out there. If you're like me, I'm a pastor here up in Michigan. Bruce is a brother there teaching on the West Coast of the United States. And for me, at least, Bruce, I cannot memorize worth a lick. And so to hear you saying, no, I'm going to take this slow. I'm a year away. I've got a goal a year from now. I'm going to take this slow and go work through a verse at a time. Even somebody as gifted as you, just taking that approach, that's a very humble approach that's helpful to me. It's an encouragement to me. I hope that's an encouragement to the audience. Go ahead.
And let me just add, I run every morning. I'm 75 years old, so this isn't as easy as it used to be. I used to run maybe 40, 50 miles a week. Now I run about maybe, 10 miles a week, 12 miles a week, something like that. But I run a couple of miles every morning. And so this is the technique I've used from the beginning. Before I go out to run, it's usually early in the morning, maybe 4:30, 5, something like that. I will memorize a verse, maybe take 5-10 minutes, make sure I've got it in my head. And then I will, as I'm running, just recite along with what else I've learned along the way. And I found that in running a couple of miles, you can usually recite as you're running along there, maybe 5 to 7 chapters of the Bible, unless they're unusually long chapters. The whole book of Revelation only takes roughly an hour to recite out loud or to read. So it's not as if this is some Herculean thing. It's not genius. It's not even being all that smart. It's just being patient. And patience is the key. And I found it was very helpful to tie this to something I do as part of my daily routine anyway. So I'm not carving out new time for some new project. I'm just saying, hey, as long as I'm out there running, I might as well make some good use of the time. And so I think I'll just recite some Bible to myself as I do so. So, that's my technique. Others may do it differently, but anyway, that's the approach. And it's been very rewarding. At this point, just, for what it's worth, I've actually added so that right now I have memorized from the book of 1 Thessalonians on to the end of the New Testament.
Wow.
So all of those, 1st, 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Jude, all of that, and so part of my regimen is to just go back and review those, make sure I've still got them. And then as I'm comfortable with that, I'll add another book. So I'm kind of working backwards through the New Testament here. And, it's no great credit. It's no great accomplishment. It's just something you can do if you have a little patience and just to incorporate the discipline that a person needs to do such a thing.
Yeah, no, that's such an encouragement. I mean, I'm hearing biblical encouragement from you, Brother Bruce, just discipline, humility, patience. I mean, these are all things that are extolled throughout the New Testament. These are the virtues that come by way of the Holy Spirit, right? These are the work of God in our lives. And it's just an incredible encouragement to hear you bringing up examples, I mean, almost Puritanesque, right? We could even say just in daily life, right? What does my faith actually mean for me in daily life? Well, when I'm running, this is a way that I can use running and capture running for the sake of the Lord. So that's really great. Well, what experiences or stories do you have in ministry that have impressed upon you the importance of eschatology? You've mentioned in the past, I've heard you say about how you taught Revelation once, right? Was that early in the 90s or maybe late in the 80s? Mm-hmm. And then you got to teach it here in the midst of COVID. What are some of the experiences that you've witnessed in your own life or in the lives of those around you that have said, this eschatology stuff, this stuff matters?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, I have the benefit of having been on the other side of the fence for a good long time. I grew up in that dispensational outlook and took it seriously. I remember when I was in college at Whitworth, this was when I was still pretty confirmed, my dispensational outlook, Hal Lindsey was speaking at a nearby campus. This was before he was very famous. He hadn't written his book, Late Great Planet Earth, or any of his other books yet. He was still with Campus Crusade for Christ. I liked Campus Crusade, and so a bunch of us got in a bus, and we rode about a mile, or I should say about an hour, to where he was speaking. This was, I want to say, in 1968. And it was, he's a great speaker. And at that time, he was a young guy and these were college kids. And so it was kind of a rollicking good time, and we all enjoyed it. But he gave his last lecture before we all went home the next morning on eschatology. And of course, he was at that point, Dallas Seminary graduate. He was very much in that dispensational school. And he had put together quite a case for the fact that we were living in the end times. And that's what he wanted to leave as his final address to us college students. Well, I was a young, impressionable kid. I think I was a sophomore at that point. And he made a case that just blew me away. It was from Ezekiel 37, Ezekiel 38, some verses he pulled out of Revelation, some, comments from here and there elsewhere, strung them together like pearls on a string. And basically, he reached the conclusion at the end of this presentation that, of course, he did the obligatory, no man knows the day or the hour. He made that clear. But then he said, from what he was looking at in terms of geopolitics in the world, the Soviet Union, China, other geopolitical realities in the world in which we were living in 1968, he could not imagine that the return of Christ would be any later than 1975. He thought, of course, he believed a pre-tribulation rapture, and he believed that sometime between 1968 and 1975, the rapture would happen. He called it the Great Snatch, he used that kind of jargon. And he convinced me, I'm sitting there, a college student, there are 500 other I think he convinced everyone in the room. We all, were pretty much convinced. And I remember thinking as I was riding home the next morning on the bus, why am I in college? If Christ is coming back in 1975, what a colossal waste of time for me to be going to class and studying all of this stuff that I should quit college. I should drop out. I should go preach the gospel on street corners. I should try to win as many souls as possible, because for crying out loud, Jesus is coming back, and we're at the end of the world. And it's time to do kind of short-term adjustments in one's life. Well, that's where I was in 1968. I got back to Whitworth. I'm very grateful that God had in my life some much more sane, balanced minds that said to me, just on the off chance that Jesus doesn't come back by 1975, maybe it'd be a good idea to stay in college. You never know. No man knows the day or the hour. Maybe you should just hang in there and go ahead and see this through. I am so grateful, that counsel was given to me, and I did stay in school. And gradually, I think I began to realize that view that we're living at the very end of history has a quite profound effect on the way you view the meaning of your life. It's one thing for me to believe that Christ could return at any time. It's another thing for me to believe that Jesus is in fact going to return in this very near time frame. One simply leaves me with a sense of expectancy, and that's good. The other actually makes me change my life. I begin detaching myself from anything with a long-term sort of explanation. I like to think today I live trying to have a meaningful benefit, make a meaningful contribution into the lives of my great-great-grandchildren that I will never meet. Mm-hmm. But I know my children, I know my grandchildren. I don't have any great-grandchildren yet, but I'm sure I'll never meet my great-great-grandchildren. But my hope is that by investing in a long-term view of things, I can actually have an effect that will influence them. They may never hear my name. That's not the point. But the point is I want to instill in the people I can touch such a sense that God is at work, that it will influence them and influence their children and so on. If you believe that Jesus is coming back in the next 5 years, you don't think about your great-great-grandchildren. It becomes a colossal irrelevance to worry about what may happen in 50 or 100 or 500 years. Long-term planning, goes down the tubes. And I think I realize I'm very grateful to Hal Lindsey for giving me a good close-up exposure of the wrong way to do it, I'm not sure I would have had quite the same grasp of that had I not had that experience. So the much too long answer to your good question is it just seems to me that when you really believe that God is building his kingdom in history, and we have a great, wonderful, glorious destiny that the church is working toward, and it may be another 1,000 years, it may be another 10,000 years before we realize it, but we all have a role to play in getting us there. It creates a very, very different view of what our lives are about. The Puritans influenced me. It was in the 70s, that I studied them closely, and although I didn't embrace that view at the time, I became quite familiar with it. They believed that they were building for generations to come. When Winthrop stood up and gave a sermon entitled, "This is a City on a Hill," at Massachusetts Bay, that's because he thought for generations to come. What they were establishing here was going to be a light and was going to be a basis upon which people would come to faith in Christ. And that was very much in his view. And I have to say, that's kind of a lost view of things in contemporary Christian circles, especially those that have been touched by dispensationalism. Where is that city on a hill anymore? It's more of an escapist theology that says, hey, we're living at the last few minutes of history. Let's save as many souls as we can because it's all going to end here very shortly. And I don't know that really is a healthy way to think about life and think about our purpose.
Yeah, and we could even say that impacts not only our long-term planning, as you said, but that even impacts our discipleship and how we make disciples, right? The emphasis then becomes saving souls. No one here at Eschatology Matters thinks that saving souls is not a godly thing or not something worthy of pursuit. Right. Don't hear what I'm not saying, right? But at the same time, there is built into the Great Commission an assumption and an underlying aspect of the command that has something long-term to it. Jesus said, make disciples, not just get converts. And so there's a difference there that ethically plays out that points us, I think, towards, and what I'm hearing you say, points us towards a long-term planning that leads to a depth of faith and to a depth of life that echoes what Jesus taught, not only that he came to give eternal life, but life abundant. So that's tremendously encouraging. Are there any other aspects of biblical eschatology that you think of that really help inform our ethics and the way how we interact ethically as Christians, and the way how we build nations, the way how we build churches, the way how we work together, the way how we interact in the marketplace, but also in our homes? Does eschatology matter for us on both a global scale, but also on a daily basis for ethical living? I've heard the answer to this a little bit in your discussion and in your story with Hal Lindsey. I mean, my goodness, what a trajectory change in your own life, right? You never would have graduated had you just gone with the impulses from your bus trip to visit Hal Lindsey.
Right.
So what are some other aspects maybe of ethical living that are informed by our eschatology, or that go uninformed if we've got underdeveloped eschatology?
Yeah, well, that is another great question. It does seem to me that, when you think about ethics, there is what's called personal ethics, that I should live a certain life with certain disciplines, avoiding immorality, avoiding, this or that, dishonesty, lying, stealing, cheating, and all of that kind of thing. And that's personal ethics, and that's very important. There is a level of ethical concern, however, that reaches outside my own personal life. It is a more expansive understanding, and I would tie it to what's commonly called the public square. To what degree is my ethical conviction appropriately to be exported into the culture? There has been, especially in evangelical Christianity in America, tend to have a highly privatized understanding of our duties as Christians, and a kind of fortress mentality, I would say. It has a very interesting history. In fact, I'm reading right now, I haven't finished it yet, a book that you may be familiar with, entitled The Rise and Fall of Dispensationalism. I'm trying to think of the guy's name, and I'm just blanking on it right now. I'm only about a third of the way into it, but it's readily available. It's very good because it is not what you call a critique. It's not written to bash dispensational theology. That's not its purpose. There are books out there that do that, but this is not one of them.
Is that by Daniel Hummel? Is that the one that you're thinking?
I think that's right. Hummel
Okay.
is the right answer. Yes, yes. But I've been very impressed. It's written at a fairly scholarly level. It's readable, but it's not flamboyant. It doesn't have a lot of kind of sort of emotional content. It's really very factual, very historical, well documented. And all he's doing is tracing the effect of dispensationalism in American history. And of course, it goes back to John Darby, the early 1800s, and he was not an American, but he did come here, and then he covers people like Brooks and Schofield and others who were very important in bringing that dispensational understanding into America, which replaced what had been the more Puritan tradition that was part of our original DNA, which had a very optimistic view of the purpose of America, kind of a nation of destiny and so on, a great positive impact in the world. The whole missionary effort of America, even to this day, has spent by far more money on foreign missions than any other country in the history of the world. Why? Because we believe that we have this very distinct responsibility. But the case is being made there that in many ways that kind of dispensational view began to change the self-image of American evangelical Christians. And that there tended to be an effect in the psyche of evangelicals that we are not supposed to be involved in this kind of culture-building activity. We're not supposed to be out there trying to improve life at the political level, the institutional level, even the educational level. There's a kind of view in dispensational thought that history is going from bad to worse.
And almost, if I dare say, we need to let that happen.
Yes, exactly. It's a side point, but it reminds me of a sermon I heard. I heard the sermon when I was 10 years old. I don't remember a whole lot about being 10 years old, but I was in my little Baptist church, and we had a guest speaker in the church, and his morning sermon concluded by saying, if you'll come back tonight, we had evening services, of course, in my church. He said, I'm going to tell you why Richard Nixon did not win the last election. I was 10 years old. The year was 1960. Nixon lost, much to the grief of evangelical Christians. It was a Catholic who won, John Kennedy. And we thought this is awful, that there's a Catholic in the White House now. This was quite a horrific development from that point of view. Well, the sermon that evening, I listened quite attentively as a 10-year-old. The sermon he preached was that if Nixon had been elected, it would have postponed the return of Christ. That it's a proof that we're living in the end times, that a Catholic has now been elected president of the United States and he's in the White House. That shows how bad things are getting, and that shows how close must be the return of Christ now that we see this. It's exactly what you were just saying, that if you do have this conviction that history is going from bad to worse, that we're living in what Scofield called the Laodicean age, that we're living in the world of the lukewarm church, if we do anything to try to resist that, we're actually forestalling the return of Christ. It's a strange, odd, highly counterintuitive view of things, that I should actually be praying for things to get worse because that's going to speed up the prospects of Jesus' return. But that is the odd place where you tend to wind up when you embrace with, thoroughly, sincerely that view. I know some people might take offense at that, but as a practical matter, that tends to be the practical effect of that end of the world mentality. Whereas, if I believe that I can go out and roll up my sleeves and get involved in political things and issues of the day and sexual issues, abortion issues, blah, 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 all of the things, of course, that are highly important in our culture, and that I might actually be able to change things, that I might actually be able to see an effect in this influence of moving a culture in a better direction, that actually is in some sense or other making good on the promise Jesus said that he would be with us as we made disciples of the nations, as you were saying. It's not just winning individual converts, it's discipling nations to obey all the things that I've commanded you. Now, obviously, right now in our culture, we're dealing with a ghastly perversion of sexual ethics. It's just, I use the word ghastly on that one. I just realized, now it fits, Just the most distorted and really outrageous redefinitions of the most fundamental realities of human existence, all in the name of saying we don't want to do it God's way anymore. We think we're gods. We think we can do it better. And so get rid of all of this traditional ethics and Christian teaching and all of that. Well, this is the opportunity of a lifetime for Christian people to be out there beating the drum for what is manifestly a view of our human existence, which not only comports with the way we're actually born and created and so on, but manifestly is the most healthy and happy way for human beings to live. And if we kind of retreat from that in the view of saying, well, this is just another sign that we're living in the end times, and so it just proves one more kind of convincing evidence that this is the end of the road. Well, if we
another nail in the coffin sort of thing. Yeah, exactly.
Then what have we done? We've just walked away from maybe an opportunity of a lifetime to have a voice in the conversation to the extent it's happening out there in the public square.
It's been amazing to see some of my own friends, very close friends, brothers and sisters in the Lord, have a dispensational mindset. They've been shocked and unsure how to respond to things like abortion being repealed federally, and Roe v. Wade. Right. Like it's been shocking to see that, and almost it's strange. It really, I agree. I love that word here that's used. It is strange as biblical Christians to see on an issue like you said, like abortion, like some of the other issues that you mentioned, a Christian ethic being extolled and being upheld in the public realm.
Yes.
And then there's confusion and uncertainty amongst my brothers and sisters who are of a dispensational persuasion, going, well, wait, I guess I need to go back to my chart and rethink some of my understandings here. And so it can be a very strange thing. Indeed. Well, let me ask you a couple of wrapping up questions, Bruce, and thank you so much for your time. My children just personally are going to be super excited that they're going to get to listen to Bruce and to Daddy chat, because they get to listen to Bruce from time to time at nighttime as they're going to sleep. So that was just one point that I was jotting down, just listening to your story back in as a 10-year-old listening to the sermon. That's just an encouragement. 10-year-olds do listen, they do pay attention, and they save things for a long time. So thank you for your ministry, and the 10-year-olds in my house are hopefully going to remember much of the biblical instruction that they hear from the many pulpits that we get to go to, and from you as well here on YouTube. But let me ask you, what's a biblical passage that you'd wish was more prominent in discussions about eschatology? You've memorized Thessalonians, and you've memorized Revelation. Corinthians, you're not to Corinthians yet. You're not that far backwards in your memorization backwards. But I would imagine 1 Corinthians 15 comes into play, as well as some other passages there in Corinthians. What are some biblical passages, not that are the magic bullet, the silver bullet, but what are some biblical passages that you would encourage folks who are beginning to study eschatology and beginning to ask questions like what you were asking during your time at Whitworth and coming out away from Hal Lindsey talks? What are some biblical passages for folks to be thinking about a theology of hope rather than maybe a theology of despair?
Yeah, that's a great question, boy. I think the Great Commission is probably the first thing that would come to mind because it sort of dawned on me once. I don't know why I hadn't thought of it. I was in the middle of a lecture, actually, in Mexico some time back, teaching through an interpreter to some Mexican pastors. And it hit me like a bolt. I thought, what have I done? How did I miss this? You know how that you have that experience of it? This is what
every week during sermon prep. Just every week during sermon prep, Bruce.
So anyway, and I brought the point out just extemporaneously on the spot because I thought this is obviously a legitimate application of this text. If Jesus commands us to do something and promises to be with us in it, then it would be almost an act of sacrilege to say the job's not going to get done. Mm-hmm. So I would say, just rethinking, go into all the world, teach, make disciples of all the nations, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you, and I am with you always, for alls in that verse, all of which, of course, are arguing that there's a great project that's afoot here, and that we are part of it. I like your reference to 1 Corinthians 15, especially the text there where it says that then comes the end, when Jesus gives the kingdom back to his Father, and you almost hear in that text implied, at least, mission accomplished. I don't think, honestly, the mission is accomplished yet. I know my full preterist friends think it all got finished in 70 AD, mission accomplished. So now what do we do? I go work on our golf game, I guess. What? It's like if we really believe the mission is accomplished, it has some pretty significant impact on what I'm going to do tomorrow morning. But if I think there's a mission that's still yet to be accomplished, then it's going to give me a kind of a different view of things. The book of Revelation is just replete with hopeful, optimistic verses. Chapter 15 says, all nations will come and worship before you. All nations will come and worship before you. I know premillennials say, well, that's talking about the millennium. Well, you've got to bring an awful lot to that text to reach that conclusion. You have to presuppose that basically as an a priori to reach legitimately that as a view of that verse. A much more natural view is simply that God is at work and that eventually all nations are going to worship. All nations are going to recognize as an official policy of the nation the truth and the legitimacy of Christ as King and the Christian message that he stands for as the proper foundation upon which to build a nation. I've made a case on in another series that the United States is founded on Christian principles. It's Presbyterians in the American Revolution. I'm a Presbyterian, but in fact, Presbyterians were probably more instrumental. They were viewed as a bunch of rabble-rousers in the colonial period, but it was
the Presbyterian Rebellion, right?
Exactly. That's what it was called in England, the Presbyterian Rebellion. But what's that saying? It's saying that this nation, our Constitution, James Madison was trained personally, privately by John Witherspoon, who was a Presbyterian pastor and scholar. I don't think he ever let that view go. And it certainly filtered into his way of constructing the Constitution. In other words, it's possible to have a nation that is based on the foundation of Christian principle without necessarily trying to become a theocracy or something like that, whatever people may think that means. It simply says that we believe the best way to do, political life is to take seriously a biblical outlook, that people are fundamentally evil, that we therefore need to be very guarded in how much authority we give to people, that it needs to have checks and balances. Madison said if all men were angels, we wouldn't need government. Well, sure enough, but people are not angels, so we need government, we need restraints and so on. And so all of that is simply saying, without necessarily becoming, trying to be, in a sense, to avoid making the state become the church. Mm-hmm. The state is not the church. The state has a restraining influence, and there's a Christian way to do the state, mm-hmm. which still leaves the church free to do what only the church can do, which is preach the gospel and do that sort of thing. I hope that makes sense, but it seems like there's two different institutions there, and each has its, its job to do. And so all of that was sort of getting back to that Revelation 15 text, all nations will come. In chapter 5 of Revelation, they will reign on earth. That's a description of these who are God's people. What does that mean to reign on earth? It doesn't mean to be kings and queens necessarily, but it does mean that we are priest kings, that we have the instrument by which life on this planet is influenced, namely the Word of God, that as we speak the Word of God with credibility in the public square, it has a supernatural impact. People may not like it, but the fact is God has invested His Word with power. And the gospel is power, and it's a power unto righteousness. And even if it's not the righteousness of salvation at a certain point, it has a kind of righteous impact in a broader sense of lifting the whole public morality, of lifting a sense of decency and orderliness in life and so on. Those are the kind of texts that would come to mind. I'm sure there's many others, but the New Testament seems to me breathes an optimistic view. People say, well, what about all those verses that say, in the end times, people are going to be bad and it's going to get worse? And you think, yeah, it was true. The last days ordinarily in the Old Testament or in the New Testament are speaking of the last days of the Old Covenant era, pretty clearly, because Paul obviously and other authors who use that term, the Hebrews and so on, are contemplating relevant statements with respect to the audiences that they are addressing at the time, not audiences that may be 2,000 years in the future. It was a time of great turmoil in the last days of the Old Covenant era, and those texts can certainly be understood in that way. But underneath that in the New Testament is a broader theme of we have a great, wonderful work to do that is going to have an extraordinary impact in human history, and that we can joyfully be about it and expect, by God's grace, that He has blessed us to be a blessing, and that blessing is going to flow in our own time and for generations to come until finally the job is done.
Yeah. What an eschatology of hope, a theology of hope. Well said, Brother Bruce. I'm so thankful for your time here today. I do want to ask you about projects that you're working on at the moment. I've followed you for a couple of years now, not quite a decade, but almost a decade, just as the YouTube channel went up. And I can remember when your YouTube followers were in the single digits, single digits and hundreds. I remember that, and I just remember going, man, this guy's incredible. What a blessing to his church that he is. And I'm so thankful that he's using technology to be a blessing to others, right? We've been blessed to be a blessing, just as you said. Yeah. So it's a wonderful thing to get to sit down with you. But I'd love to hear upcoming projects that you're working on. You've shared that before about your ongoing scope of a project of working through the New Testament. How's that going? What are the projects going on at the moment that you're teaching through, and what's yet to come? Yeah, well, thank you. Your kind words, I take to heart. Believe me, it means a lot, and I have to say, no one is as astonished as I am
I just like to teach, and is what I've done. And I've never regarded myself as some kind of great talent, but it's the only way I know how to do it. So that's what I do. It was a friend of mine who once said to me at church, he said, I think you should upload this stuff to YouTube. I didn't know how to do that, and so he explained it. It wasn't that tough. And so I, started off a little thing. It was pretty kind of raw at the beginning. And I have to say, no one has been as stunned as I have been. 50,000 subscribers at this point, pushing 10 million views. I mean, to me, that is a great proof that there's a God in heaven, and that He'll use the likes of me to do some things. And I just pray and hope that the general effect of this has been to help people, who trip across this stuff here and there. So anyway, it's been a wonderful project. What I'm currently working, in fact, I'm preparing right now the book of First Peter. That right now I'm working through the Gospel of John. We have one more year of that. My next installment in that is this coming Sunday. In fact, we're back to it now in this new church school year. We'll finish John this year, Lord willing. I've done everything in the New Testament except Matthew and the encyclical letters, except for James. We did James at a certain point. So I want to do 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Jude. And I think that'll probably take about a year. So that'll be the next year. And then I'd like to go back and pick up Matthew, and that'll probably take about 3 years. And at that point, I was joking with my class the other day, I'm going to be about 80 years old, and they said, well, you just keep going. I mean, what does that have to do with anything? But as long as the mind is reasonably clear and my health is good and God blesses me with the ability, then I'd like to go back and do some more in the Old Testament. But that's kind of the long-term plan. We'll see what shakes out, in time to come. So I'm expecting that from here on in, I'll be doing mostly biblical themes, Old and New Testament, and that's kind of the plan. Now, I do have a kind of partially completed series that covers political theory. It's related to my Presbyterians and the American Revolution. I keep adding new little installments to that as I have opportunity. So I'll probably keep adding to that from time to time as we go along. But that's the basic plan at this point.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Brother Bruce. It's been a wonderful delight for me. I just would love and cannot encourage folks enough, if you're looking for information and more wonderful, helpful teaching regarding postmillennial thought, regarding the Puritans, regarding church history, regarding even what I think is fair to summarize as almost chapter by chapter approaches in a Sunday school setting to many books, to a host of books in the Bible. And this is coming from a pastor who oftentimes is using various commentaries. I consult and learn from Pastor Bruce, from Brother Bruce all the time, from Elder Bruce all the time as I'm looking through and looking at different passages myself. So I'm very, very thankful for Bruce for you taking the advice of your friend and for uploading onto YouTube. And I would just pass that along to everybody, whether you're a Bible scholar, whether you're a Bible novice, whether you've got questions about eschatology or you're just getting started, or maybe there's even other questions, other particular topics or other passages that you're going, I wonder what this passage is about and what's the context of it. I would just encourage you, there's probably a wonderfully solidly taught Reformed perspective from Brother Bruce on his YouTube channel that will be linked down below in the video description. So Brother Bruce, thank you so much once again for your time today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jacob. It's been a pleasure.
Seated here at my right hand.